5th of October 1965. "50 years ago today, my best friend and longtime friend, even at that time already a longtime friend since we met in grade school, and I landed in Prestwick, Scotland. We had flown on a rickety DC-3, two-engined airliner from the 1950s to Toronto, got on a BOAC 707 and flew to Prestwick, a very rough flight. I got sick on the flight. We landed in Prestwick, which is outside of Glasgow. For some reason, I had decided we would begin our Europe journey in Glasgow, Scotland. It wasn't a particularly good choice. Glasgow in October has terrible weather, traditionally, I guess. In Glasgow itself, in the 1960s, was very, very similar to Gary, Indiana, which is near where I grew up, in a place that I avoided. So we got there, we found a bed and breakfast, and I'll explain to you in a little bit how we found that. And we settled in on our great European journey. Our journey through Europe was highly influenced by a book very few of you probably have seen, unless you're my age. I'm 74 years old, by the way. Not that that has anything to do with it, certainly not with the book. This is the book. You can see it here. There, you should be able to read it there. It's called Europe on $5 a Day by Arthur Frommer. This is the 1965-1966 edition. I still have it. Can you imagine Europe on $5 a day? Well, we never probably, or very rarely, were able to spend only $5 a day. But I don't think we ever spent more than $8 or $10 a day while we were traveling at that time. What this book was is a list of recommendations with little maps of places you could find to stay overnight, where you could eat decent food at the lowest possible prices. This book, I see, cost $1.95 at the time. It had 621 pages, including a map of Europe, which is not very much of a map. It was a very practical guide, and it helped us a great deal. We couldn't have afforded any other kind of a trip through Europe. Of course, nowadays it would probably have to be Europe on $50 a day, or maybe even more. And more, I guess. I don't know if you could live on $50 a day traveling in Europe, at least. We use this book to find bed and breakfasts in Glasgow and in London. In London, on Russell Square, a beautiful place that we stayed in. I think we paid the equivalent of about $2 a night. And it was very enjoyable. It's a very good book, and I'm thankful we had it. After I lived here a while, I never looked at it again. You learn to deal with with the situation and find your way around better. One of the funny things that I noticed at the time was that occasionally someone from the US would come to visit us, and they had the impression, it seemed they had the impression that only wealthy people could come to Europe normally, and so someone who lives in Europe had to be wealthy. Well, we weren't, of course. Jim and I were both graduate students. We were both married, and we were earning very, very little money. So we traveled and had a good time. We had no plans to stay in Europe, but we also had no plans to return to the United States. We had no plans at all, and we didn't have return tickets, and we didn't have enough money to buy return tickets. So at least for the time being, we were planning to stay in Europe. I won't tell you in detail about our trip leaving Glasgow, going to London, from London to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Cologne, Germany, from Cologne to Munich. I won't tell you the details about that because I have wonderful pictures upstairs, slides that all need to be scanned in, unfortunately. I just don't have the time or energy at the moment to be looking for them, so I'll save the details of our journey until some other time. I'm making this video for myself because it was a momentous occasion 50 years ago today. It was a momentous occasion in retrospect because I left the country that I was born in. I was born in Hammond, Indiana, by the way, in room 220 of St. Margaret's Hospital in Hammond. Hammond is right on the border to Illinois, at Lake Michigan, Cook County. I can't remember whether Cook County is. No, that's in Illinois. That's where I lived. I forgot what county Hammond is in. In any case, I'm a Hoosier, and people sometimes ask me, why did you leave the United States? Well, our plan was not to leave the United States. We'd have taken the United States with us if we could have. Our plan was to come to Europe. And like I say, we didn't have plans whether we'd stay here or not. I have to admit that I personally never felt at home in the United States. I was always very uncomfortable for some reason. I don't think Jim felt that way, but he was very passive, and he and I were friends, and he didn't have any other plans. Well, we both had plans, I have to say that. We were both admitted to the University of Hawaii to study marine biology, actually. But we decided instead to come to Europe. I wanted to come to Europe because my grandfather had told me stories. I loved my grandfather. He was a very kind and gentle man. He came from Switzerland. Hi, Valentino. Our 15-year-old cat and I, Valentino here and I, are alone at home today. I loved my grandfather. He was born in Switzerland. His father was a restorator of buildings. He was an engineer. And my grandfather told me all kinds of exciting stories when I was young about growing up in Europe, about living in castles, which he did when his father was restoring them. His father restored the castle at Königsburg in Alsace. And also the famous Miramar Castle in Trieste. In fact, that's where my great-grandfather died during that project. He wasn't young. I don't know any details about why he died, but he died during that project. It was a 20-year project, so the likelihood of him dying was probably pretty large. He was probably in his 70s already too. So I was excited about the idea, the prospect of coming to Germany. Jim was a history buff. He enjoyed history. He read every book he could find about Lord Nelson, the battles that Lord Nelson led, and he was also very knowledgeable about the Second World War, and he wanted to see some of the places that he'd read about, of course. So we came to Europe ready to see what we could see. And what happened in telegraph form, short form, we spent about 4 or 5 months at the Goethe Institute trying to learn German, well, ostensibly trying to learn German. Mostly we drank beer, lots of beer, and had a wonderful time in Bad Reichenhall, which is very near Salzburg on the border of Germany and Austria. We put skis on our feet for the first time at that time. We traveled around Europe. We drove to Copenhagen. We had an old Fiat 750 Yachts, it was called. It was actually made in Austria. And there were no floorboards in back. They were rusted out altogether. We put some carpets kind of in back just so that feet didn't get completely wet. The car was a wreck. It was really a wreck. It was terrible. But it was all we had, and we couldn't afford to buy anything better, so we drove it and had it repaired. In fact, I learned the word for cylinder head in German before I learned how to say hello or good day. I knew what the words for camshaft were. I knew what the words for valves and for pistons and timing chains. I knew all those words in German before I learned to speak any conversational German at all. Thanks to the Fiat. We came to the point at the Goethe Institute where the courses were over. It was too expensive to take another course. And I had come to Germany partly also because I had met people, friends at Purdue University, where Jim and I both got our bachelor's degrees in microbiology in 1965. Actually, Jim got his, I think, in 1964, and I got mine in 1965. Jim went to work for Lever Brothers in Roby, Indiana, right near Hammond. And I worked summers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and the New York Central in stories I've told about on my videos here, I believe. When we got to Europe and it had been at the Goethe Institute, we learned enough German that we could just pass it. Well, we could order a beer. we could order a beer. No, we learned some German. It was all right we could get along all right. But I had met these people at Purdue University that had come from a town called Tübingen in Germany, which is south of Stuttgart. And they said, well, if you go to Germany, you contact Professor so-and-so and he'll get you a job there at the Max Planck Institute. Well, that didn't work out. But somebody else learned about me being there, and I finally got a job as a technical assistant at another Max Planck Institute, Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics. I didn't know what that was, and to this day I'm not absolutely certain. But once I had gotten in there, I was able to find a job for Jim at another Max Planck Institute, Max Planck Institute for Virology. And so Jim began his PhD work there. That was in 1966. I began work on the sixth day of the sixth month of 1966 at the Max Planck Institute, 6th of June. And life took over from there. We did a lot of traveling, spent nine weeks in Turkey, enjoyed it very much. It was a beautiful country and lovely people. And I rebuilt a piano. The piano is still here with me. A piano that ostensibly belonged to the Desert Fox. It came from Panzerkaserne in Böblingen, down by Stuttgart. And Rommel was supposed to have owned it at one time. I spent 600 hours rebuilding it. Much to the, disappointment of my, that's probably not the right word, but it's close enough, of my doctoral supervisor, who wanted me to be working in the lab instead. I did work in the lab. It took me 7 years to get my PhD. At that time, that wasn't that unusual. It was a big project. It was a huge project. Not only did I do original research, but I also completely built up from scratch an electron microscope laboratory. I had had some experience with the electron microscope at Purdue University because I had seen an electron microscope when I was about 8 or 10 years old at the ESSO, I think, well, at the time it was called Standard Oil Laboratories, somewhere near where I grew up. I think in Harvey, Illinois. And I was so fascinated with this instrument, the electron microscope, that I decided already with 8 or 10 or how old I was that I really wanted to use one someday. And at Purdue University I was able to actually do some work, even as an undergraduate, on the electron microscope. Because I met these people from Tübingen, Germany. It all fits together like a puzzle. So I got my PhD, let's see, it was 1973. Yeah, 1973. My first son was born that year, Kurt. And I continued to work at the Max Planck Institute. It was an unfortunate situation because biological cybernetics is something that's done by physicists and mathematicians. And I was no good at math, and as much as I loved physics, I didn't have the background for that either. So I was always an outsider there, and I finally left there in 1977. because a friend of mine with whom I played music, I played clarinet, he had become the head of an institute in a town called Giessen, Germany, north of Frankfurt. And he called me up one day and he said, "Bruce, do you know somebody that plays clarinet and can use an electron microscope?" And I said, "I only know of one person like that." And he said, "Yeah, I do too." He said, "I'm looking for someone like that." So, in the meantime, my second son had been born, and I knew I had to leave that lab in Tübingen. It was no longer, it was evident that I was not going to feel comfortable there. If I had stayed another year, I probably would have been in a position to stay there the rest of my life, but I didn't want that. I wanted to go somewhere where I could do work with people that I could share with and understand, and who could understand me. And so I picked up my young family with a third child on the way, by the way. Also my third son, Eric, was on the way. And we moved from the beautiful town of Tübingen, just an absolutely gorgeous town, to the less than beautiful town of Gießen. However, we had a nice home. We had actually a farm. It was a farmhouse in the country. Perfect place to raise children, of course. My third son was born in Gießen. And life went on.